You know, folks will start to pick apart my story. I've had many folks accuse me of not being a survivor, which is really gross.
Heidi, people like Cartman, they always make things someone else's fault. We all wrongly see ourselves as the victim sometimes, but Cartman sees himself as the victim all the time. He'll always find someone to blame for his shortcomings, and because of that, he's never going to change.
Everyone wants to help victims, or at least the vast majority of us do. But does that mean that those who seek to gain power, attention, or wealth can abuse our collective goodwill by assuming a victim identity to benefit themselves? The term virtue signaling has entered the cultural milieu, referring to someone who portrays themselves as virtuous, often advocating for a cause, not so much because they truly care, but because the appearance of caring paints the signaler in a positive light, often being rewarded for their display with social and even financial support. However, there is a similar, somewhat less infamous phenomenon known as victim signaling, wherein someone portrays themselves as a victim to garner sympathy from others, and often is showered with social and financial support. These two combined behaviors form the virtuous victim effect, a powerful sociological phenomenon in which one can maximize the rewards derived from the pure goodwill of others, with no real need to be concerned about real victims, nor real virtues, only personal benefit. Today we will be examining the virtuous victim effect, how society gives moral and trust deference to self-professed victims, how those who claim victimization utilize that identity for individual gain, the paradox of virtuous victims believing that they are entitled to act immorally, the relationship between virtuous victim identity and psychological disorders, and of course, who tends to portray themselves as a virtuous victim, using one particular person as a case study for our analysis, Eliza Bleu. But before we start talking about the oft-poetic nature of the virtuous victim phenomenon, allow me to serenade you with a little acrostic poem sponsored by your boy, Raid Shadow Legends. R is for role-playing, which is fun and free, pillaging dungeons and winning tourneys. A is for the arena, where you can test your skill against player foes. I is for the internet, which facilitates battles against those you oppose. D is for danger you will face on your quest. But try Raid out for yourself, and perhaps you'll become the best. No, I will not apologize for the poem. In all seriousness though, Raid is a completely free-to-play turn-based RPG for mobile devices and PC, with over 650 unique champions from a wide variety of factions, of which the High Elves and the Sacred Order are my personal favorites. For me, Elhain is best girl, but there are tons of other champions, all of whom you can check out via the index, that I personally would also love to collect, like Deliana here, who just looks freaking awesome. The more you play, the more you can upgrade your champions with different gear and use the tavern to create your own completely customized dream team. And right now is the perfect time to check out Raid for yourself to see what millions of people have been talking about. And that's because Raid is celebrating their 4-year anniversary, which means all kinds of special offers, free gifts, promo codes, and events are waiting in store for you, including a brand new Fusion event where you can earn a special anniversary-themed legendary champion. New players who click the link in my description or use the QR code on the screen will also get the epic champion Kellen the Shrike. But hang on, because the birthday celebration train doesn't stop there, as you can also use the code 4YearsRaid to get your hands on 4 legendary skill tomes to give your champions a serious edge, plus other useful stuff. Bonuses that are available for all users, not just new players. Thanks so much to Raid for sponsoring this video, and now that we've been rewarded with all kinds of goodies from this birthday celebration, let's talk about how some people can use the identity of being a victim as a way to extract rewards for themselves, beginning with a case study on the virtuous victimhood effect. Before we get into the research regarding virtuous victimhood, let's begin with an example of the phenomenon by looking at a particularly egregious case. In late 2022 and early 2023, Eliza Bleu, a self-proclaimed anti-trafficking advocate and survivor, began to gain notoriety online, largely for her alleged, albeit without much evidence, representation of women professing to be the trafficking victims of social media personality and former professional kickboxer Andrew Tate. But Eliza had been making appearances on various conservative podcasts for several years at that point, telling her personal story of surviving and advocating for the rights of victims, as well as children being able to consent.
So let's pretend like we all have our like utopia. So if I could answer this in utopia, right? In my like perfect ANCAP utopia. Each community, and each, so it'd be each caregiver, parent, and community, including teachers, potential faith leaders, and neighbors, will decide if the child is ready to consent and look at the child's behavior. Do they have a job? How is their education going? Are they cognitively available to have sex with this individual? And then also look at the history of the individual as well. So does this individual have a history of abuse?
Yep.
And you go from there.
Yep.
Eliza has also gained attention for working with Elon Musk to help develop new tools to protect children and victims of abuse on Twitter. Surely something that I think we can all agree is a net positive. In January of 2023, after her second appearance on the popular YouTube show Timcast IRL, internet personality Brittany Venti posted screenshots of a music video that Eliza appeared in and had been posted publicly on YouTube and the World Star Hip Hop website since 2016, in which Eliza danced provocatively while scantily clad, which I cannot show you any images of because of what happened next. And what happened next? Well, it could only be described as scorched earth, with Eliza seemingly using her connections to Elon, and specifically with her apparent friend Ella Irwin, who works for Twitter Trust and Safety, to quickly have any evidence of this music video or even discussion of her past removed from Twitter, resulting in the censorship not only of Venti, but numerous YouTubers, including The Quartering, Yellow Flash, That Star Wars Girl, Lauren Chen, Chrissy Mayer, Legal Mindset, That Umbrella Guy, and many others whose Twitter accounts were locked or YouTube videos were hit with privacy and guideline complaints, as she claimed that she was being re-abused by these critics. Except the problem for Eliza was that the internet does not so easily forget, as the old meme goes. And when you try to cover something up, you invigorate interest into the subject matter, what I would call psychological reactance, but which is probably more well known as the Streisand effect.
Do you know who I am?
No?
Oh, I bet you do. I'm going.
Stop that!
Soon, seemingly everyone was looking into Eliza's victimhood and activist claims, from her supposed opening of a safe house for which there's no paperwork, to her claims of being trafficked twice, once as a minor and then again several years later.
I met a photographer that said that he wanted to make me a star, and he thought that I had the potential to have a modeling career. He was from Los Angeles. I flew to Los Angeles not long after that. My mother accompanied me because I was a minor. I really wanted to be something great. On that trip, I was under the influence of drugs. I went back home to the farm and dusted myself off. So I finished my education early because of being homeschooled. And the same photographer that had assaulted me introduced me to a high-profile musician. The high-profile musician said, come out to Los Angeles, we'll start a music career, you're gonna be a model, you're gonna be a musician, you're gonna be famous. When I got to Los Angeles, I was addicted to a drug that I only know as ice, because I really wanted to be famous. So the gentleman ended up selling me after a couple days. I remember it clearly. I was sold for $500. My memory is very spotty because I had had a lack of food, I'd had a lack of water, and I was on drugs and other substances. So I was so difficult for the gentleman that purchased me to handle that he actually gave me back. They released me from the hospital and I flew back to the farm. I called my parents on a 911 and I'll never forget that. I rolled back home with a trash bag. After I got it together a little bit, I mean, it was maybe 2 weeks that I spent back on the farm getting it back together. I flew back to Los Angeles because I had moved. Within a couple hours, I remember contacting the same person that had done the original trafficking.
Which simply doesn't align with basic facts and timelines, including her former life as a groupie for the band My Chemical Romance and appearing on the reality TV show Blind Date at the same time that she says she was first trafficked for $500.
Where is it?
Right here.
I know, but where'd you get hurt?
That's okay, I'm fine. It's just like a little scratchy. It's okay.
During the second period during which she claimed she was trafficked, she got married and moved to Germany, got divorced, came back to the States, and became engaged to MCR frontman Gerard Way, earned a cosmetology license, auditioned for American Idol, and then later became an Instagram model who had the freedom to turn down $150,000 for intercourse, something that most victims of trafficking would not have the option to reject.
What's been your strangest booking request so far?
Oh my God. $150,000 to have sex. I mean, It's a nice offer, but it's not me.
Turned it down.
I did, yeah.
She appeared in numerous hip-hop music videos as a video vixen, including that infamous one produced by World Star Hip Hop that I can't show you, even though at the time she approached them to film it and spoke about it quite fondly.
I was blessed to work with one of the dopest directors in the game. Like, he had a Red Dragon camera, and I almost pissed myself because it was like, a Red Dragon camera is so expensive to work with. This was like a vision of mine, not the actual video, but like the idea of wanting to do something of that caliber was so it was literally so humbling. Like, it dropped me to my knees. I just feel so blessed. And the way the whole thing came about, and I've never even told anybody this besides maybe a couple of girlfriends, was I had a vision. I couldn't sleep one night. I couldn't sleep. And I had a vision. I said to myself, what would take me to the next level, like for myself? What will get me to that next level? I just got this thing in my head, like World Star. World Star reaches the most people. And I wrote the actual World Star website. I wrote them in email. It was short and sweet and to the point. My name is Eliza. I'm different. I come from the shy. I just want a chance. I'm always going to be different. I'm never going to fit anywhere. Just give me a chance. So I actually wrote Q, the owner of World Star, which has turned out to be such a blessing to me. I'm not even going to lie. He's like a little angel. He doesn't even know he is. But he turned out to be such a blessing. And by about 10:30 in the morning, from about 6:30 to 10:30 in the morning, we had already started negotiations for my video.
Fast forward to 2023, and Eliza began striking any video or tweet that used images from that specific video and quickly began trying to generally delete all evidence of her past. World Star Hip Hop has since confirmed that she was paid to appear in that video and does not own the rights to it. But still, I cannot even show you a screenshot of it here. After dropping her 2010's Chi-Town hip-hop video vixen identity, she adopted a new one, that of a victim, and appeared on podcasts to talk about trafficking. She started several crowdfund campaigns asking for money and claimed that she was so poor she didn't even have access to the internet.
Trafficking victim, that's going to help is me. And I'm a human trafficking survivor, but let me tell you what it can help by. Number one, I don't have internet at home. Number two, I wasn't set up for this year, so I don't have a computer at home. Hotep Jesus knows this. Number three, I borrowed this beautiful light that's giving me this look from my barber.
In another one of these podcast appearances, she claimed people using images of her to catfish on Twitter was also a form of human trafficking, to a confused Michael Malice.
I was trafficked on Twitter as well. So there's been 3 profiles to my knowledge that my former abusers made to traffic me on Twitter. I didn't realize because I kind of just signed up for Twitter in late 2019. So it was like one of the last few days of 2019, I signed up for Twitter.
But what does that mean that they trafficked you on Twitter? How can someone traffic you if they're not in contact with you?
Yeah, so the way that was working, I didn't know about the profiles existing because I wasn't on Twitter and I wasn't looking for them. The way that my former abusers were doing it is that it was going back to my Instagram. The Twitter accounts were linking back to my Instagram and they were trafficking me off Instagram, Backpage, sugar daddy websites. I mean, whatever type of internet trafficking is what was happening. I'll go into more detail. So it looks like a profile. In my particular case, the profiles look like profiles that would be me, but trying to entice business to sell me, bringing it back to my Instagram where they were doing business. Fortunately, in my particular case, there are no nude images or videos of me on Twitter. Thank God, right now. The day is young, I guess. But it would go back to my Instagram and that's how they would traffic me, sell me without my full consent and without my knowledge.
Basically, nothing she said was making any sense, thus the general public began to question her story. This came to a head when Tim Pool, who had hosted Eliza twice on his massively popular podcast, refused to address the allegations, arguing that the audience reaction was artificially created by a PR firm and telling those who were unhappy to just leave.
Scroats McGoat says, last night as a member, if Tim doesn't disavow Eliza tonight, get the out, Scroats McGoat. You can cancel right now and see you later. You will never wave money in my face and make me disavow anybody, especially someone I care so little about. Eliza Blue. She's been on the show 2 times. If you're gonna cancel because I won't do what you say, you shouldn't have been here in the first place. Bye-bye. Don't let the door hit your ass on the way out. So What I think is going on, to be completely honest, is that the people who are claiming they hate her are actually probably a paid reputational firm to promote her. So that's why I brought this up last week. There are companies you can hire that will spam the internet to generate buzz and attention for you. There's no such thing as bad press.
Then subsequently allowing the publication of a series of articles on his website from journalist Shane Cashman, who not only failed to ask Eliza any hard questions, but made new and strange allegations of gang stalking, being injected with a mysterious drug by said stalker, blackbagging and black vans harassing her, as well as less potentially legally actionable claims against those talking about her past, insulting anyone asking questions, calling them leeches and, ironically, pole dancers for attention, only for the articles to be later removed under the claim that the readers had just misunderstood them. So, who is Eliza Bleu? A woman certainly with a complicated past. Being born Eliza Morthland, daughter of a now former Illinois Republican representative on a 500-acre farm.
Are you in contact with your daughter right now?
I'm not granting you issues at this time.
I really understand. It's just I really want to help your daughter. I'm concerned about her.
That's sweet. Yeah. Well, okay. Let's put it this way. If she tells me to talk to you, I will have a conversation.
A girl who in 1999, at age 17, moved to LA with the financial support of her parents, trying to make it big in Hollywood as thousands of girls do every year. Then she was Eliza Cutts, an MCR groupie in the early 2000s. Then she was the wife of a serviceman, Eliza Sipe. Then after a divorce, she was once again a scene girl who in 2006 moved back to Hollywood and got engaged to Gerard Way, wrote fan fiction about their relationship, and became infamous amongst fans. After the two separated, Eliza Sipe continued to seek fame by auditioning for American Idol, and a few years later reinvented herself from emo girl to hip-hop video vixen, Instagram model, Eliza Knows. In describing what Eliza Knows did, in seeming agreement with Annie Lobert, she was a prostitute with a pimp, although she didn't have the right words to describe it in the early 2010s.
I was actually searching on YouTube for ways to increase my profits, if that makes any sense. We'll leave it there. And it encouraged me through a series of videos to reach out for help. I didn't know that I was being trafficked until I saw your videos, and it changed my life. It spoke to me. Listen, Annie, if it wasn't for the way that you look, and it sounds so superficial, but the lifestyle I was leading, it sounds superficial, but you know what? I don't care. The lifestyle that I was leading was all about superficial and all about the look. And if it wasn't for how you look, I never would have connected with your energy or your vibe. I would have never even taken a second look. It was because of the way that you looked. I was like, okay, cool. I don't have to leave this life. Let's keep it real. I don't have to leave my pimp and become a nerd. I thought I was going to be a nerd.
I wanted to say something first that you said that I'm a survivor of human trafficking. I did say that, but not till later. What I first said was, I'm an ex-prostitute and I had a pimp. And everyone's like, and it's your fault. But
we didn't happen. But Annie, we didn't have the language to put to it. We didn't have the language to put to it back then. I mean, this wasn't a conversation the way that it is now.
By 2016, Knows, now in her mid-30s, asked for and received her dream music video that she'd hoped would finally launch her into stardom after all those years. Again, the same video I can't show you, the same one that has been censored everywhere. After a few years of relative silence, around 2020, she re-emerged as an anarcho-capitalist advocate against sex trafficking and victims of trafficking, such as herself, gaining the ear of Elon Musk, and all under a brand new name, Eliza Bleu. And that's who she still is, at least for now. I do not claim to understand the intricacies of every element of Eliza's claims and story, not only because it's a mess of contradiction, but because the details of one particular instance of this phenomenon are not the real purpose of this video, just an apt case study that I will be using to make the data that we're about to look at a bit more salient. The former kind of research is done far better by the folks over at Kiwi Farms than by me. The downfall of Eliza Bleu in the court of public opinion is illustrative of how society is, in fact, very willing to trust and believe victims, give them deference and even resources, so long as they believe their claims of victimhood are legitimate. And most people won't even question those claims for fear of further harming a victim. But Eliza Bleu is, it seems, a symptom of how that deference can be abused and misused. how the goodwill of the public and our deep desire to not only believe victims, but specifically believe victims who portray themselves as virtuous, can be manipulated by those who seek to gain power, fame, and ultimately resources by distorting that goodwill. Let's examine the virtuous victim phenomenon and how victim status can be corrupted, as well as the psychology behind who tends to use and abuse such tactics and why. There are always only so many resources to go around in this world, and only so much concern that can be allocated to any individual or cause, and thus, for the last decade, scholars have been interested in how victimhood itself can be competitive, with victims fighting for goods, care, and attention, as was assessed by Knorr et al. 2012, largely in a group context. However, they also proposed several elements to competitive victimhood at an individual level: moral typecasting, social comparison, the magnitude gap, and biased individual memory. Moral typecasting describes the propensity to assign people into a singular role as victim or perpetrator that are mutually exclusive. Only one person or group is often seen as being capable of being the true victim in some conflict. It is psychologically comfortable to presume a victim is only a victim in isolate, not also a potential mutual abuser, as the Amber Heard case so aptly illustrated in the public eye.
You got hit. I'm sorry I hit you like this, but I did not punch you. I did not deck you. I was hitting you. I don't know what the motion of my actual hand was, but you're fine. I did not hurt you. I did not punch you. I was hitting you.
Social comparison is the tendency to, well, compare ourselves to others as a benchmark against which we judge the self. In the case of competitive victimization, people may make positive social comparisons to those who are wealthier or more successful than he or she is as evidence of unfairness or victim status. The magnitude gap is a phenomenon that occurs in the perceptions between the minds of victims and perpetrators, in that typically perpetrators of some misdeed will recall the act as far less serious than will victims, who tend to recall the act as far more severe, whatever that act may be.
You know, I tried to befriend you just so you'd leave me alone. Hey Liz, how's the telescope?
I don't know, Kelsey. How's your mom's pill addiction?
Similarly, everyone's memory is biased in some manner towards themselves, and thus will tend to be self-serving to a certain degree as well.
人を殺したんを初めてやったんや。自分でもよう覚えとらん。
Although Knorr et al. Can give us a basic theoretical framework, the majority of research conducted on the topic of competitive victimhood has concerned intergroup victimization rather than at the individual level. So, who tends to see themselves as a victim and under what circumstances? Gebbe et al. 2020 examined personality variables and the tendency for individual victimhood, or TIV, across a series of studies, the first of which were used to develop a new scale to measure such a tendency. In their first exploratory study, Israeli participants were asked to write down 3 instances wherein he or she had felt hurt across 3 relationship contexts: hierarchical, communal, and equality-based. Further studies were utilized to test factorial validity and test-retest reliability, producing 4 categories: need for recognition, that is, that it is important for others to recognize the perceived hurt experienced by the subject; moral elitism, that is a perception that the self is morally superior to others; lack of empathy, that is an excuse for one's own actions as simply being misunderstood, and that those who are hurt or offended by those actions are the real perpetrators of harm.
Last thought I killed a family. And I'm supposed to what? Complain? Because hers wasn't one of the hundreds of families I did kill.
And rumination, that is pervasive thoughts about the perceived injustice. With the scale in hand, participants read a series of 4 vignettes that described either an extreme or mild social infraction and were asked to rate the severity of the event described in the scenario. Tendency towards interpersonal victimhood was associated with more intense reports of the vignette's severity. That is, seeing the self as a victim meant that such a person perceived all infractions as being more severe, even when reading about an event that occurred to another person. People who see themselves as victims, then, are seemingly hypersensitive to perceived victimization. A second study examined various personality variables associated with tendency towards individual victimhood, again, TIV, including attachment styles, being avoidant, anxious or secure in relationships, rejection sensitivity, which asks participants how concerned being, for example, denied a favor from a friend would make them feel, victim sensitivity, such as feeling angry when others receive a reward that the participant believes that he or she actually deserved, self-consciousness about how one presents the self both publicly and privately, tendency for forgiveness or tendency for revenge, and entitlement to immoral behavior, such as believing it is acceptable to hurt someone who has hurt you.
When we found out what was going on, we beat Carter senseless to make him stop. To get us back, he set off a homemade bomb in our outhouse, right when Natsuko was on the toilet.
They found that TIV was positively correlated with participants' rejection sensitivity, victim sensitivity, private consciousness, public consciousness, and motivation for revenge, but not with motivation for avoidance nor for benevolence. The higher one's interpersonal victimhood tendency, the less willing that person was to forgive, and TIV was the single best predictor of entitlement to engage in bad, immoral behavior, followed only by motivation for revenge, indicating that people who see themselves as victims are uniquely prone to believe that they are morally superior to others and should be allowed to harm others when they are feeling victimized. That would explain why Eliza Blue feels uncompelled to apologize for causing harm to others by reporting their accounts. She believes, via her victim identity, that she is entitled to do so. Next, the researchers turned their attention to the relationship between TIV and a sense of exaggerated relational entitlement, measured with questions such as, quote, "When I am not getting what I deserve from my partner, I become very tense," end quote. Depressive rumination, and the Big Five personality traits, which are extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness, conscientiousness, otherwise known as orderliness, and neuroticism or emotional stability. This time, TIV was positively correlated with participants' exaggerated sense of relational entitlement and rumination, and was negatively correlated with trusting others. Of the Big Five personality traits, TIV was unrelated to 4 of them, but was positively correlated with neuroticism, again, emotional instability.
And haven't I earned a right to my gallows humor after all? Are you forgetting that just this afternoon I was punched in the face by a man now dead?
In their third full study, the scholars hypothesized that TIV would be related to a tendency to attribute negative feedback to the inherent negative properties of an offender in a given situation, and that those high in TIV would report being uniquely emotionally hurt by recalled offenses. In other words, if you feel someone has hurt you, while also feeling like a perpetual victim, it's because they are a bad person, not because of any misunderstandings, but instead because they're just, well, evil. In this experiment, subjects completed the TIV instrument and were then given a vignette that asked them to imagine themselves in the role of the main character, a lawyer who had received criticism from the senior partner at their firm.
What? Cliff, if this is about the bagpipes...
It's not about the bagpipes. Well, of course it's the bagpipes. It's the bagpipes and it's the not flushing and this optical migraine you call a business suit.
The text was unclear on whether or not the critique was justified, and participants answered a number of questions regarding the prompt, including if the criticism was malicious, what aspect of the person was being criticized, such as performance or ability, and their desire to seek revenge against the partner or to avoid the partner in the future. Subjects were then shown a list of positive and negative emotions and asked which words they remembered seeing after the fact. Higher levels of TIV were associated with more negative attributes given to the partner at the law firm, a greater recall of all negative emotions, and a desire to seek revenge. Specifically, the more one attributed the criticism of the senior partner to his or her negative attributes, the greater the reported desire for revenge. Thus, seeing the self as a perpetual victim seemingly produces a tendency to attribute more negative qualities to others who are critical of the self or one's behaviors, and a desire to get revenge against those critics. In the case of a perpetual victim, then, like Eliza Blue, it's easy for her to support the deplatforming of critics because her victim identity is related to a belief that any and all criticism comes from an inherently bad place and from bad people.
Today, I have decided to change my story as a survivor. I have been abused a 3rd time on a massive digital scale. It's called image-based sexual abuse. Every individual who knowingly profited off of this content without my consent has become my abuser in my story. You didn't fight censorship, you fought to exploit me. Nude or partially nude sexually suggestive content without my consent. If you would have asked, I wouldn't have consented. You believed that I consented previously, so you decided to take my body and use it for your gain. So to prove that I'm not a survivor, many made me a victim again. You can never say that I'm not a survivor of exploitation now because you made me one. Again. You didn't fight to expose government malfeasance or tech censorship. You fought to post my body without consent.
In a 4th study to better understand the relationship between tendency towards individual victimhood and revenge, participants played a computerized version of the Dictator game against what they believed was another player but was, in fact, all pre-programmed. In this game, Both supposed participants were entered into a raffle to determine how the two of them should split 10 Israeli shekels, a little less than $3 US. However, as mentioned, the game was scripted so that the computer always won and offered either a mildly unfair split, giving 4 shekels to the participant, a moderately unfair split, allocating 3 shekels, and a severely unfair split, leaving the participant with only 1 shekel. Subjects were asked how hurt they felt by the deal.
Rabbi Chaim Goldenstein Shekelblatt says, "Hello, Goyim. I wanted to donate $30 to help promote this Holocaust Orphans Fund. I get a 37% share of the proceeds, so $10 is an acceptable loss." He donates $5.
What negative emotions the experience evoked, if they believed they were morally entitled to take revenge, and then were given a potential opportunity to get even, being asked how much, if any, the opponent's winnings they would like to take from them, under the condition that the subject, him or herself, would not receive any of that money, making the act purely spiteful.
Yeah, this is gonna get playfully anti-Semitic, so just allow it to go there.
Tendency towards individual victimhood predicted taking revenge against the other purported player in the mild offense condition, but not more in the moderate or severe offense conditions. Although TIV was not related to actually seeking revenge in the more egregious cases of unfair treatment, the tendency was related to more reported negative emotions and towards a belief that one is entitled to behave immorally when there was a mild infraction. Perhaps then it is not victims of more serious harm that seek to cause harm to others in recompense, but instead people who think that, for example, just posting pictures from publicly available modeling shoots and music videos that the person themselves consented to being in is a form of human trafficking are the same kinds of people who will use such minor issues to call for crusade and for vengeance. Model analysis was indicative that, specifically, the more one's tendency towards individual victimhood, the more negative emotions the dictator game produced, which in turn resulted in greater propensity to seek revenge. And although TIV was also related to entitlement to immoral behavior, that entitlement did not predict more vengeful acts in aggregate, only in the mild condition. It seems then consistent across these various studies that people who see themselves as victims will be more negatively emotionally affected in some situation that they view as unfair, and when they experience those negative emotions, will actively engage in vengeful behavior against those that they believed have wronged them, even if that revenge in no way benefits him or herself.
You may have forgotten me, but I will never forget you.
And instead will engage in vengeance purely out of spite. Those who see themselves as victims then seem to believe that they are entitled to act immorally due to their victim status, that they are owed special privileges or powers. However, most people don't take too kindly to immoral behaviors, and may be less understanding of a victim who uses their status to harm or victimize others. Thus, many people who see themselves as victims instead engage in virtue signaling, portraying themselves as virtuous victims, such as to aid in resource extraction from others, resources that their victim identity causes them to believe they are owed. Although virtue signaling is commonly used as a buzzword, to be clear on what I mean by the term, I will be using the Oxford English Dictionary's definition, which is, quote, "the conspicuous expression of moral values done primarily with the intent of enhancing one's standing within a social group," end quote. If a person who believes they are a victim, regardless of whether or not they actually are, because of a tendency towards individual victimhood, they may seek to portray themselves as virtuous, such as to be better able to induce others to voluntarily share material or symbolic resources with them, and because of the relationship between TIV and entitlement to immoral acts, these people often also believe they are entitled to exaggerate or even lie in this pursuit of virtuous victim resource extraction, or such as was the hypothesis of Ock et al. 2021 across a series of experiments. To begin, the scholars wanted to see if people really were more willing to donate resources to someone who was a virtuous victim. Thus, participants read a short story about a 45-year-old man named David who had been married for 25 years and recently was paralyzed from the waist down as the result of a gunshot wound to his spinal cord.
You're never gonna walk again. I've just sliced your spinal column.
Some subjects read that David was shot while volunteering at a charity softball game intended to raise money for disabled children.
Thank you for not saying skill issue when my dad was complaining about his job. I know that took restraint. But, you know, still sucks how that brain surgery panned out.
Others read that he was shot while walking in front of a grocery store, and still others read that he was shot while at a strip club despite being a married man. An instance of a man seeking to blow some girl's back out only to get hurt with a very spicy Uno reverse card.
Henshin!
What the hell is this?
But anyway, in all cases the shooting was seemingly random, and David had no connection to the shooter. After reading about David, participants were asked the extent to which they believed that he had been victimized, the severity of his injury, and his personal morality, as well as if they would consider donating to David's rehabilitation fund in general, and if they would be willing to donate should they happen to have an extra $100 in their budget at the end of the month. Participants were more likely to report that David was a virtuous victim when he was shot while volunteering for charity, compared to the neutral condition and the strip club condition, and similarly perceived him as being more victimized when he was engaging in a virtuous activity. Respondents reported that they were more willing to donate to David when he was virtuous compared to when he had engaged in neutral or immoral acts. And relatedly, they reported being willing to donate more to David when he was a virtuous victim. Thus, yes, it seems that people will be more willing to help a victim when they believe that victim is of high moral character. And as such, if you want to portray yourself as a victim for the purpose of resource extraction, it's probably best to portray yourself as being virtuous and having not engaged in immoral behavior. Hence why a certain anti-human trafficking advocate and supposed victim reacted so violently to being exposed as being a former willing sex worker and video vixen. The second in the preliminary studies in this set was intended to investigate the effect that explicitly signaling virtue or victimhood would have on assistance seeking via an online crowdfunding platform. The researchers created 4 different versions of a GoFundMe webpage that described a woman named Jessie.
Bunch of slap-jawed f***s around here. This stuff will make you a goddamn sexual tyrannosaurus.
Who was seeking $6,000 in funds to finish her education at a local community college to become a hairstylist. No other information about Jessie's life was included, although one could assume that some hardship had led her to her current predicament, representing a weak victim signal without any virtue signal. In the strong victim signal, no virtue signal condition, additional information about Jessie's difficult upbringing with her drug-addicted single mother, her previous relationship with an abusive partner, and personal struggles with mental health being included in the description. In the strong victim virtue signal condition, Jessie's troubled background was again described, with Jessie also stating that she volunteered at a local senior home and was an advocate against the opioid epidemic, raising awareness about it on social media.
I'm not on drugs. I'm on pills, for God's sake!
Further, Jessie stated that she would use her esthetician license to give free haircuts to seniors at the home she was currently volunteering at. A hairstylist with a tragic backstory including abuse who just wants to be an internet advocate but needs to crowdfund money to afford her new career as a podcaster. Wow, I'm not sure I could have made this stimuli more relevant to the Eliza Blue situation if I had written it myself. But hilariously, I didn't. Finally, in the weak victim virtue signal condition, Jessie's backstory was omitted while her volunteering work was included. After reading the alleged GoFundMe page, participants were asked how willing he or she would be to donate to help Jessie in her goals, how deserving Jessie was of receiving support, how moral she was, and how victimized she was, using the aforementioned definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. Additionally, respondents were given 2 open-ended questions, one asking, what part of Jessie's story made you willing or unwilling to help her? And the second querying, quote, why do you think she is deserving or undeserving of support, end quote. Subjects rated Jessie as significantly more moral when the virtue signal message was included, and similarly rated her as being more victimized when there was a strong victim signal. Jessie was seen as being the most deserving of help when she was a victim with a strong virtue signal, followed by when she was portrayed of as a victim with no virtue signal, then when she was not described as a victim but as virtuous, and finally when the GoFundMe page described her as neither a victim nor as virtuous. The same pattern emerged as it pertained to willingness to donate to Jessie's GoFundMe campaign. In terms of the open-ended responses, those who mentioned something about Jessie's virtue in the answer, a total of 38% of all responses, were significantly more likely to say that they wanted to help Jessie. These results then are indicative that people are most willing to help someone who they believe has been mistreated, but is also virtuous and charitable themselves. If you want to start a fundraising campaign, such as a GoFundMe then, your best bet to earn the most amount of money is to portray yourself as a victim who is dedicated to helping others. Well, that doesn't sound at all like our present case study of Eliza Blue, who proudly showed her Twitter followers a video of her winning an award for her activism, even though during the event the host couldn't find a single thing that she had actually done. Although it seems this was just a tech problem, it's still very poetic.
My words do not do her advocates to justice. Let me show you a few examples of some of the things that Eliza just said.
Oh, I gave him now.
Jan, is it?
Yeah, it should be on yours, so click forward. It should have.
I don't think he got it.
He didn't. Yeah, I'm sorry. He didn't do a mashup. I apologize.
Okay. Eliza has posted.
No, it's okay. I know my greatest hits.
In a third experiment in this initial set, the researchers manipulated the study to understand if familiarity would influence willingness to help someone out. That is, are people more willing to donate to someone that they know versus a stranger online? Specifically, the virtuous victim was described as, quote, someone you know who claims to have experienced disadvantages or difficulties in his or her life that make it hard for him or her to achieve their goals and maximize their capabilities, and who you also consider to be a highly moral person. Or in the second condition, an immoral victim was described as a highly immoral person. Participants were asked to think of someone that they personally knew who fit either description and think about 3 examples of signals that person sends out into the world regarding their victimhood and morality. Then participants were presented with 10 mini scenarios involving this person, including them needing help in moving to a new house or apartment, or needing help fixing an appliance or repairing their car, and asked how likely they would be to help that person out in each scenario.
I'm so glad you're moving out of this neighborhood, Annie. Some dude peed on my car while I was parking it.
Oh, you met Spaghetti.
Yeah, I won't miss him.
As expected, respondents who were asked to think about a virtuous victim reported that person as more moral than those asked to think about an immoral victim. However, perceptions that the person was a victim did not differ across conditions, indicating that while people can perceive some victims as more virtuous than others, that does not decrease the perception that they are, in fact, a victim. Expectedly, participants reported being most willing to help a virtuous victim and least willing to help an immoral victim, with morally neutral victims falling somewhere in the middle of the two. Once again, this aligned with willingness to donate, with subjects being willing to donate more money to a virtuous victim that they personally knew compared to a neutral victim and then an immoral victim. Thus, it doesn't seem to matter if the alleged victim is someone that we know personally or a stranger on the internet. Virtuous victims are seen as being more deserving of social support than are those who are morally neutral or immoral. Thus, there is nothing that would disincentivize a random person online from fabricating or exaggerating claims of victimhood in order to extract resources from well-intentioned strangers. Understanding who is more likely to receive support from others, virtuous victims, Akadal's second series of experiments instead focused on what motivates victims to emit a virtuous victim signal. Across 2 samples of over 1,500 American and Canadian participants who were questioned about how frequently they had been victimized from never to always, and how they signaled this victimhood, which ranged from not feeling financially secure to having few opportunities growing up, feeling one doesn't have social support, worrying about one's safety, not feeling accepted by society, feeling unable to pursue day-to-day activities, feeling stereotyped or marginalized, to feeling one's rights have been violated, all were assessed. With victim signaling identified using confirmatory factor analysis, the scholars could then use their developed scale in subsequent research regarding resource extraction. In a second experiment, subjects' victim signaling and virtuous victim signaling, including the symbolic and internal importance of being seen as a victim or as virtuous, were measured in addition to the dark triad personality traits, those being narcissism, a tendency towards pride and egotism, Machiavellianism, a tendency to manipulate others, and psychopathy, a tendency towards antisocial, selfish, and remorseless behaviors. Portraying oneself as a victim was positively correlated with all 3 dark triad personality traits, but most robustly with Machiavellianism, again, a tendency for manipulation. Victim signaling was also positively related to symbolic moral identity, but negatively related to moral identity internalization, meaning those that display themselves as victims do not necessarily see themselves as moral, but they wish to be seen as moral by others. Perhaps that is only the case when they know their victim claim is erroneous. However, this study did not assess that potentiality. Predictive regression analysis further revealed that Machiavellianism was the strongest predictor of victim signaling and virtuous victim signaling, while the relationship with psychopathy turned negative. These data are seemingly indicative that being perceived of as a moral person can fulfill narcissistic individuals' desires for social approval and admiration. Further, the centrality of Machiavellianism in the model illustrates that victim signalers tend to be manipulative, perhaps illustrating that those who see themselves as virtuous victims are very often prone towards manipulation, but not necessarily involved in overtly selfish, antisocial, or remorseless behaviors, likely because those behaviors prevent that person from being seen as a truly virtuous victim. As such, virtuous victims are more than willing to be manipulative and self-centered, but typically do not wish to engage in aggressive behaviors that may call their virtuosity into question, and may instead choose to just, for example, ask all men to help. Given that it seems that virtuous victims are willing to engage in immorality so long as that immorality likely does not compromise their capacity to seek sympathy from others, Akadal's third study examined the relationship between virtuous victim signaling and entitlement to the resources of others, including using deception to benefit the self. Participants in this study completed the moral identity scale, victim signaling scale, and then were shown 3 pairs of shoes.
You shut up.
That's why your shoes raggedy. That's why your mama dead. Dead as hell. What shoes she got on? What shoes she had on her casket?
Labeled as authentic, generic, and counterfeit, along with a story that described the authentic shoes producers as having registered the brand name and logo using superior quality materials. The authentic shoes were slightly different in appearance and priced at $129, while the generic and counterfeit shoes were identical and priced at $49 each. In contrast to the authentic producer, the generic brand was described as being designed to resemble the authentic brand, but did not utilize their trademarked material, while the counterfeit brand was intended to imitate the authentic product and infringed upon that brand's trademark. Or in other words, this entire scene.
Anyways, the shoes you want, I swapped them out for fakes. Swapped in fakes. Buddy on Indiana Jones. Cap.
Respondents were asked which shoe they would prefer to purchase and questioned about the morality of purchasing the counterfeit product, including if purchasing such a product would make them feel good. Finally, subjects' dark triad personality traits and general entitlement were measured. As in the previous study, victim signaling was positively associated with symbolic displays of moral identity and negatively with internalization of moral identity, again meaning that they didn't see themselves as moral but wanted to be seen as moral by others. Victim signaling was also positively correlated with a sense of entitlement and with all 3 of the dark triad personality traits, both individually and in aggregate. Further, both victim signaling and virtue signaling were positively associated with proneness towards counterfeiting. Across the entire sample, most people expressed being the most willing to buy the authentic shoes, followed by the generic shoes, and finally the counterfeit products. However, the composite measure of virtue signaling and victim signaling predicted willingness to purchase the counterfeit shoes. Possessing the dark triad personality traits was similarly positively related to a willingness to purchase the counterfeit products. The takeaway from this particular experiment, then, is that people who see themselves as victims, particularly as virtuous victims, also see themselves as being entitled to special treatment and perhaps for that reason believe they are entitled to engage in deceptive behavior, such as purchasing a pair of shoes intentionally designed to resemble a designer product for a fraction of the price. Those who see themselves as virtuous victims then also tend to be manipulative, self-centered, and when put to the test, actually willing to engage in immoral deceptive behaviors, at least particularly in the context of how they portray themselves, such as is the case in choice to purchase authentic versus counterfeit sneakers to display to others their value as a person.
Give me the Timbs. Give me the Timbs. Give me the Timbs right now.
Not the Timbs.
In the case of someone like Eliza Blue, someone who sees and depicts themselves as a virtuous victim, they will, yes, tend to be more likely to be egotistical, manipulative, and selfish, and will also be more willing to deceive others, even over something as simple as their choice of kicks, believing themselves to be entitled to the positive perception such ownership might bestow upon them socially. This behavior is evident from her asking Hotep Jesus for a portion of his live stream income, to her claims of opening a safe house without providing any documentation of its existence. A 4th study in this set sought to further understand the relationship between virtuous victimhood and tendency towards duplicity for the purpose of acquiring resources from others. As before, subjects responded to the victim signaling and moral identity scale, and then were informed that they were to play a coin flipping game wherein the winner, who correctly guessed the results of the flip, would win a $1 bonus for their participation. The game was played using a virtual coin toss program. Players were instructed to click the skip question button if they received a prompt to keep playing after losing the game once. with the researchers describing this as a known bug. The game was rigged such that players always lost the first coin flip, but participants could continue to play for 3 tosses, when they were only supposed to play for 1 game after losing. Out of the 3 tosses, the first 2 always resulted in a loss, while the third resulted in a win. Thus, even though respondents were told to always click skip question after the first loss, they could keep playing until finally winning on the third toss. Essentially, cheating. Participants were then asked to confirm if their first guess on the coin flip had been correct, which of course the truthful answer was always no, but allowed subjects to believe that they had an opportunity to deceive the researchers. Following the game, respondents answered an honesty-humility scale, which included questions such as, quote, I want people to know that I am an important person of high status, reverse coded for humility, and, quote, if I knew I would never get caught, I would be willing to steal $1 million, reverse coded for honesty. Once again, virtue signaling was positively related to victim signaling, and both were negatively related to internalization of moral identity. Victim signaling was also negatively related to the honesty-humility measure, indicating that people who tend to wish to display to others that he or she is a virtuous victim are less humble and less honest than those who do not. Across the entire sample, 66% followed the instructions by skipping the subsequent coin flip games after the initial failure, and 73% skipped the subsequent game after their second loss. Of the 17% who continued on to the third flip, they tended to be higher in virtue signaling and the composite virtuous victimhood identity instrument. And all participants who continued on past the first flip were higher in both victim and virtue signaling. 7% of the sample directly lied to the researchers after the fact and stated that they had won on the first coin flip, and those who lied were significantly higher on victim signaling and virtue signaling scales. Not to a computer, they lied to the scholars' faces. In other words, people who see themselves as victims, particularly as virtuous victims, are more willing to lie and cheat even just to earn an extra $1. Demographic variables were not predictive of deception, but the composite virtuous victim measure explained 18% of variance in deceptive action. In an additional test of whether virtuous victim signaling predicted the likelihood to lie about the game outcome, the model was again significant, explaining 36% of variance in deception. Let me be clear.
Let me be clear.
That means that over a third of the statistical likelihood that a given person will lie, cheat, and essentially steal is predicted by that person seeing him or herself as a virtuous victim. It's possible then that one could even be convinced to engage in criminality if they had first been convinced that they were a victim. Make of that what you will. In total though, frequent virtuous victim signalers scored lower on the honesty-humility scale, making them more willing to lie for their own personal benefit and being less humble, perceiving themselves as being entitled to not just lie, but to benefit from their lies. Again, be that raking in donations or simply being the center of attention. Be it as a groupie, a video vixen, or a public human trafficking advocate. Okadal's 5th study was designed to further understand how virtuous victims use their status as social influence tools to portray themselves as morally superior to others, as well as the influence of Machiavellianism having been found previously to be seemingly an operative dark triad variable on this relationship. This time, participants' degrees of Machiavellianism, communal narcissism, which unlike individualistic narcissist grandiosity and entitlement, is related to community and measured with questions such as, quote, I am the most caring person in my social surrounding, end quote, were all measured. Additionally, fantasy proness, a trait that is related to confabulation and exaggeration, as well as to disassociation, was measured with questions such as, quote, sometimes I act as if I am somebody else and I completely identify myself with that role, end quote. They found that virtuous victim signaling was positively and significantly correlated with communal narcissism, as well as with all dimensions of Machiavellianism, including amoral manipulation, desire for control, desire for status, and a distrust of others. Once again, virtuous victimhood was unrelated to internalization of morality, but was positively related to proneness towards fantasy thinking, such as perhaps telling a bizarre tale about how a single guy who supports himself largely by doing food delivery has also managed to purchase multiple black vans with which to stalk you.
This all started with the man we'll call the gang stalker. The gang stalker runs in a circle that's been accused of controlling hundreds, if not thousands, of bogus Twitter accounts, buying black SUVs and parking outside people's homes to intimidate. and even injecting something into someone who would wake up 2 weeks later with a piece of their minds missing.
Or that people using photos of you to catfish on Twitter is a form of human trafficking.
What does that mean that they traffic you on Twitter? How can someone traffic you if they're not in contact with you?
Yeah, so the way that was working, I didn't know about the profiles of system because I wasn't on Twitter and I wasn't looking for them.
But how are these people who are using your images making money themselves?
Blah, 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 blah.
Just as some examples of fantasy thinking. These data then are illustrative that people who perceive themselves as virtuous victims present with complex Machiavellian traits, not only being willing to manipulate people, but also possessing a desire to control others and gain power over them, while simultaneously being distrusting, even paranoid, of those around them. It perhaps should not be surprising that these distrusting virtuous victims also have a tendency towards fantastical beliefs, including that their fantasies can affect reality, as well as disassociation from reality altogether.
Goddamn dementia! Where the hell am I? Oh, I done strayed too far from home this time.
Virtuous victims then may completely invent aspects of that victimization that, due to their fantasy proneness, feel and are perceived of by them as being very much real.
Your feelings for her are not real. They are real to me!
And when that potential for confabulation and fantastical thinking coincides with a desire to manipulate and control others, as well as a belief that the self is deserving of resource extraction, even by immoral means, because the self is a virtuous victim, well, then you get people like Eliza Blue, who truly believe that they are entitled to the wealth and power of others, and that controlling others is ethical in that pursuit to obtain the recompense that they believe they are due. In their sixth and final study, Ockadall hypothesized that those who see themselves as virtuous victims would be more willing to exaggerate reports of mistreatment in order to gain power over others, and that dark triad traits would exacerbate reports of mistreatment.
Well, you can't be racist in space. Who said? Who said we can't be racist? What are you going to do about it?
In this experiment, participants were asked to imagine that they were involved in a competitive internship program at a company and that they had been treated in a manner which could be perceived of as discriminatory. Specifically, the prompt described a scenario wherein the subject got the feeling their fellow intern was speaking negatively about the subject behind his or her back, although there was no evidence for this suspicion. After reading the vignette, participants were asked if they believed that they had been discriminated against on the basis of age, gender, sexual orientation, or other protected criteria, and if their coworker had engaged in a number of behaviors that were not explicitly described in the prompt, including putting the respondent down in front of others, making demeaning remarks about him or her, addressed the participant in derogatory terms, or excluded them from meetings or functions. Again, none of this was described in the actual prompt, so subjects would have needed to imagine such an occurrence. Afterwards, morality internalization, virtuous victim signaling, and dark triad personality traits were measured. Virtuous victim signaling was associated with both exaggeration and perception of discriminatory behavior, meaning that those who see themselves as virtuous victims believe they have been more mistreated than the average person, and that they experience more discriminatory behavior when none is explicitly present.
My source is that I made it the f*** up.
Virtuous victimhood mediated the relationship between dark triad personality traits and perceived discrimination and exaggeration, indicating that people who are prone towards Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism are more likely to see themselves as virtuous victims, and thereby to also perceive discrimination and exaggerate that perceived discrimination even when none is overtly present. Finally then, we see that those who identify as victims, particularly those who see themselves as moral, virtuous victims, will invent discrimination when really there is none, and will confabulate and exaggerate scenarios to evidence discrimination even when no such evidence exists in reality. Again, people who are virtuous victims are prone towards fantasy thinking, and will create examples of victimization out of thin air to justify their victimhood status, and then subsequently use that status to demand greater resources to fuel their entitlement and to treat others poorly because of the status that they themselves have invented.
Help! Help! I'm being repressed! Bloody peasant! Oh, what a giveaway. Did you hear that? Did you hear that, eh? That's what I'm on about. Do you see him repressing me?
In the instance of someone like Eliza Blue, whose entire online persona is based on the identity of being not just a victim, but a virtuous victim who is so selfless she can't even afford internet access and needs Hotep Jesus' super chats to cover it, a starving artist in her own words.
I always classify myself as a starving artist.
and I really take that to heart.
These data provide evidence that may explain her behavior. Being so good at gaslighting, they can seemingly gaslight themselves.
You're a fundraiser for charity rather than just yourself. I'd like you to sponsor me because I'm f***ing skint.
Eliza, as a virtuous victim, believes that she is entitled to manipulate and exploit other people, be that asking for a portion of their revenue via super chats, demanding that her critics be silenced, or sweet-talking a journalist by calling him the next Andy Warhol, which resulted in said journalist writing a since-deleted multi-part 24,000-word gonzo journalism project described by many as a puff piece designed to reify her victim status.
I love you so much, Shane.
Oh, thanks.
I'm like your
Appreciate
biggest
that.
fan.
Thank
I'm
you for
very
supporting me so
excited.
much online.
I love you so much. I think you have a creative mind, and I told Shane one time, I said, I firmly believe that I had this feeling in my gut. I said, I need to ask Shane to take my picture and write an article because I have a feeling his work will end up being Warhol-esque.
To just saying she needs help from all men on Twitter to protect her from criticism. People who see themselves as virtuous victims believe their victim status gives them the right to the resources of others. Virtuous victims are susceptible to fantastic thinking to the point that their own thoughts may affect their very perception of reality, seeing themselves as being discriminated against and vastly exaggerating situations in order to reaffirm their placement in society as a victim. People who fall into this category are distrustful of others, but also seek power over them, and will imagine that they are being mistreated based largely on innocuous information, due to their propensity towards fantasy thinking. Similarly, due to their entitlement, they will outright lie to obtain greater status, all while continuing to see themselves as the ones who are really being abused, despite feeling entitled to outright abuse others in the name of being a victim. Due to the subclinical narcissistic and even delusional traits of virtuous victims then, we should ask, is there a relationship between being a virtuous victim and clinical psychological disorder? If the traits of virtuous victims sounds like someone that you know personally, it may be because they have a lot of seeming crossover with two clinical cluster B psychological diagnoses, histrionic and borderline personality disorder. The Diagnostics and Statistics Manual 5 defines borderline personality disorder by the presence of 5 or more of the following traits: fear of abandonment, unstable or changing relationships, unstable self-image, struggles with sense of self and identity, stress-related paranoia, anger regulation problems, including frequent loss of temper or physical fights, consistent and constant feelings of sadness or worthlessness, self-injury, ideation, behavior, frequent mood swings, and impulsive behaviors such as unsafe sex, reckless driving, binge eating, substance abuse, or excessive spending. In turn, histrionic personality disorder is characterized in the DSM-5 by the presence of 5 or more of the following traits: a compulsion to be the center of attention that results in discomfort if unmet, inappropriate sexual, seductive, or provocative behavior when interacting with others, shallow, rapidly shifting emotions, the use of physical appearance to draw others' attention, dramatic, impressionistic speech that lacks detail, exaggerated theatrical emotional expression, easily influenced by others or situations, or assumes relationships are more intimate than they really are with others. While I am not a clinical psychologist, merely a social scientist and really by education, specifically just a communication nerd, which is rather embarrassing, regardless, I've never spoken with, let alone have neither the capacity nor opportunity to engage with Eliza in a clinical setting. However, I would speculate that yes, Eliza Blue meets at least 5 of the criteria for a diagnosis of both histrionic and borderline personality disorder. Specifically, from what I can see as an external observer, and again, please keep in mind that nothing said here is in any way clinically diagnostic, regarding borderline, I see a pattern of unstable or changing relationships, evidenced by her short-lived marriage to Mr. Sipe and her alleged temporary engagement to My Chemical Romance frontman Gerard Way. There seems to be a clear pattern of unstable self-image and struggles with self-identity, evidenced from her frequent changing of names and identities, from Morthland to Cuts to Sipe to Nose to Blue, from scene girl groupie to hip-hop video vixen to anarcho-capitalist anti-trafficking advocate. Eliza has rarely maintained the same identity for more than a few years, and is seemingly heavily influenced by others, something I will cover in more detail in a few moments. Stress-related paranoia seems clear in the article written by Shane Cashman, since deleted, which describes a gang stalker perpetually harassing her, gang stalking is a poorly understood phenomenon wherein one believes they are being targeted usually by a group of people who are following, photographing, spying, and spreading lies about them, and has, as of yet, very little academic literature behind it. But scholars such as Sheridan and James 2015 have concluded in their assessment of over 1,000 people who reported being the victims of gang stalking that it is a delusion, in most, if not all cases, compared to individual stalking, which when reported is rarely delusional, found to be false in only 3.9% of cases. She also certainly seems to have anger regulation issues, judging from her behavior talking down to any dissent on Twitter, or as seen in her reaction to being asked basic questions about her story by journalist Katie Herzog.
So I know the basics of your story because I've listened to your podcast.
Right. So I'm trying to figure out exactly what the question is.
Well, I can ask you the questions.
I didn't agree to this. All I agreed to was answering a few questions about Twitter.
Well, okay, sure. That's totally fine. But can I ask you the questions or email you the questions and you can decide if you want to answer?
I mean, did you ask Amanda in advance to do that?
No, I told her that I wanted to ask you about the Twitter stuff and about your own story.
Okay, so you deceived Amanda, didn't tell her everything you wanted to ask me, and then you got a survivor on the phone and started asking her about her personal trauma.
No, that's not what happened. I said.
Katie, I think we're probably going to be done here. Please, just next time you want to speak to a survivor about their trauma and bring up their own.
We know that she has engaged in reckless behavior, including, by her own admission, drug abuse, stripping, and sex work, or was in a position to turn down $150,000 for sex on one occasion, which would put us in range, just from her public behaviors, of displaying enough criteria for potential diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. In terms of histrionic personality disorder, Eliza certainly seems to always want to be the center of attention. From her engagement to Gerard Way, to her participation on reality television programs, to her appearance as a video vixen in music videos, to her public persona as an advocate, and her many appearances on podcasts to promote, supposedly, victims, while claiming to be one herself and even admitting to prioritizing herself when speaking to Hotep Jesus in terms of how to distribute money. In one interview, she admits there's no such thing as negative attention for her, only the issue of how to spin it to gain greater fame.
I watch this stuff because that's the type of stuff that intrigues me, like the way that Kanye manipulates the media. I'll do something, I'm not even in a front. My World Star video did not have the reaction I wanted it to have. Right before you and I got on the phone, I was on the phone with my best friend, like, okay, how are we going to spin this? Like, world's most hated, world hip-hop eye candy, and then I go on a tour. Like, how are we going to spin this? Because every bad thing, you could turn it into something good.
Her inappropriate sexual behaviors are well documented, from her flirting with Shane Cashman on Timcast and seemingly trying to flirt with Tim and failing.
So I would lift between like 35 and 50,000 pounds per day.
That's why you're so shredded.
Sure.
I didn't want to say anything.
It's leftover muscle.
Right. I didn't want to say anything, but it's hard to not notice, you know?
Yeah. I didn't want to...
To the released video of her foot being, well, let's just say inappropriately placed on Tim Pool's co-host Ian Crossland's leg.
Why are you hiding now, Liza? What? Why are you hiding so much? Is that your foot on his thigh?
Eliza is overtly sexual. Of course, her appearance in multiple hip-hop music videos could be described as little else but use of physical appearance to draw attention from others, but is not the only example. As while Eliza was seeking fame and fortune in LA, she worked at a gentleman's club, dancing and serving cocktails.
So I went to go be a cocktail server at a gentleman's club. They said, we'll let you be a server here, but first you have to audition to dance. I did. It was great. It was great money. That's why I can differentiate between willing adults entertainer. At that time, I consider myself a willing adult entertainer.
Persistently, she has sought positions that use her appearance for attention. Her descriptions, or more aptly lack thereof, of her trafficking story across the many podcasts she has appeared on are typified by emotion but a lack of detail, evidenced by her unwillingness to give any specifics about the organization that supposedly helped her escape.
And can you say the name of the organization, or you want to keep that private?
I'd like to keep it private because my traffickers are still out there and very active, so just...
Although she did eventually clarify, after extensive public pressure, that the group was Eve's Angels, an anti-trafficking nonprofit started by a woman named Anne Dunwald, who, curiously enough, was sued for defamation by her own parents after she made claims of abuse against them and lost in a court of law. This vagueness was further illustrated in the deleted articles written by Shane Cashman that went into extensive detail about everything but the facts about her background, yet are full of emotion and theatrics. Of course, we know how she reacts when being asked to elaborate, as she did with Katie Herzog.
Got a survivor on the phone and started asking her about her personal trauma.
She certainly seems to be very easily influenced by others. While denying that she was directly mimicking former Kanye love interest Amber Rose back in 2016, others had noticed the similarity.
Has anybody thrown shade at you? Nobody? Are they just doing too much comparing? Even though I don't try to mimic her in any type of way or fashion, I truly admire her for who she is and what she has done for me.
By her own admission across numerous podcasts, she was inspired to escape her alleged trafficker after seeing a video from Annie Lobert, whose look she repeatedly gushed over, and who, well, she looks rather similar to herself during their interaction. Even her most recent name, Blue, was seemingly taken from the model Amina Blue, which she accidentally self-reported on back when she still went by the name Eliza Knows, that she admired.
The star of his Adidas fashion shows, Amina Blue, I believe that's how you say her name, the model Amina Blue. You know, she's 5'2". To throw a woman that's 5'2" as the lead model in your fashion show, that inspires me.
But also, less directly from her own admission, her heavy use of communication accommodation during her time as a hip-hop video vixen, during which time she adopted a Chi-Town persona and African-American vernacular English, or perhaps more accurately described as a black scent across various interviews, also seems indicative of someone who is easily influenced by others. Similarly, although it is difficult for us to determine as outside observers, it does seem, even from an external perspective, that Eliza also believes that relationships are more intimate than they really are, or attempt to make relationships more intimate. From her fan fiction she wrote about her own relationship with Gerard Way, to her frequent tweeting at Elon Musk, to her comments towards Shane Cashman, it seems that she thinks relationships are more intimate than they really are. Although, again, that point is mostly speculative. I must once again reiterate that I am not diagnosing Eliza Blue with anything, and predominantly I am looking at this situation as an exemplar of broader subclinical social phenomena, specifically the virtuous victim effect. However, I do think, just from the evidence that Eliza herself has made so very public over the years, it is possible that she suffers from both histrionic and borderline personality disorders, which may help give greater context to her specific conduct outside of being a virtuous victim. The diagnosis of comorbid histrionic and borderline personality disorders was also the diagnosis given by Dr. Shannon Curry to Amber Heard after 12 hours of examination, and both disorders appear predominantly in females. I felt it important to include this information in this video because I have seen that it's common for many to assume there is a deeper psychological dysfunction rather than a more simple social psychological explanation when we witness people behaving in, well, the way Eliza Blue does. But this is not a clinical psychology channel, nor am I a body language expert. I'm just a social science and statistics nerd. So with that in mind, let's get back into the statistics. With what we've learned regarding the relationship between narcissistic traits and virtuous victimhood, subclinical or clinical, well, what a particularly relevant study do we have to look at here? Bertrams and Crispin's 2022 examined how narcissism might influence the tendency for certain individuals to involve themselves in activism, specifically anti-SA activism. And I'm not referring to South Africa, but rather I have to use the acronym because YouTube really does not like it when people say the word SEX in general, but particularly not when it's followed by the word assault.
There were drei peanuts walking down the Straße, and one was assaulted. Peanut.
And while it would perhaps be amusing to instead call it something diminutive like 4C Fun Time, I feel that's probably even more distracting. So please bear with me, as I will be using the acronym SA. But the point is, Bertrams and Crispins believed that activism may serve as a dark ego vehicle that provides narcissists with an opportunity for positive self-presentation and also allows them to gain status, power, and domination over others, or perhaps just engage in social conflicts to get their thrills. In their first experiment, participants drawn from an online crowdsourcing platform answered questions concerning their narcissistic traits, dispositional altruism, and various demographic variables, as well as their involvement in anti-SA activism. and sexual harassment myth acceptance. And I must raise some qualms with the measurement of harassment myth acceptance, as it includes items such as, quote, sometimes women make up allegations of sexual harassment to extort money from their employer, as an example of a myth, when, well, sometimes women do that. Sometimes men do that.
You guys cannot go to the police and say that he molested you.
Why not?
Because he didn't molest you!
That's true, but he's a dick, and we hated him.
The Amber Heard trial showed the world that sometimes, yes, women will invent allegations for the purpose of resource extraction, or maybe just drama. So just something to keep in mind as we look at these data, that what constitutes harassment myth acceptance in this study includes items that I at least would be skeptical to describe as myths. Narcissistic traits were divided into 3 types. Antagonistic narcissism, which is typified by exploitativeness, lack of empathy, arrogance, manipulativeness, reactive anger, and thrill-seeking. Extroverted narcissism, typified by acclaim-seeking, authoritativeness, grandiose fantasies, and exhibitionism. And neurotic narcissism, typified by shame, indifference towards others, and a need for admiration. They found that younger women who had experienced non-consensual contact as an adult and had low harassment myth acceptance were the most likely to be involved in anti-SA activism. Those who scored higher in altruism were also more likely to be involved in said activism, with altruism being the strongest predictor. Really, there's no surprises there. What was interesting, however, is that higher aggregate narcissism scores were also associated with greater likelihood of being involved in anti-SA activism, and specifically, extroverted narcissism. This relationship between narcissism and anti-SA activism was also only identified in women. A second analysis looked specifically at the 3 subtypes of narcissism and again found that extroverted narcissism predicted anti-SA activism in women, but also that antagonistic narcissism approached but did not reach statistical significance in predicting activism, once again, only in women.
Women, know your limits.
Thus, we see that while altruism is the main driving factor that draws people towards anti-SA activism, there is significant evidence that so too does narcissism, specifically in women, and specifically narcissism that is typified by a desire to be in leadership positions, for fame, power, and to be the center of attention. And perhaps, although it did fail to reach statistical significance, may also be women who possess a form of narcissism typified by being manipulative and exploitative of others, angry, arrogant, and thrill-seeking. Well, I think we found Eliza Blue, a woman who has been seeking fame and fortune her entire life, be it as a reality TV star, a My Chemical Romance groupie and short-lived fiancé of the band's lead singer, a model and video vixen, or an anti-trafficking advocate across conservative new media. Eliza clearly, and by her own admission, has always wanted to be famous, sought thrills, and certainly wanted to be the center of attention. Evidenced by her gleefully asking her own mother about if she looked too sexy in the videos that she now claims were predatory.
Have you watched a couple of the music videos that I was in?
Yeah, I've watched a few of them.
You told me that you thought they were funny, right?
Well, they're funny because they're so stereotypical of what you'd expect that type of video to be.
Right, like party and whatever.
Yeah, a lot of parties, a lot of girls in short skirts, shaking their booties.
Do you think I look too sexy?
I don't think it's possible to look too sexy.
A video filmed by her after her parents supposedly had already helped her escape from sex trafficking once, and yet her mother seems largely unconcerned. Her tweeting at and working with Elon to change policy at Twitter, while seemingly altruistic on its face, has been used as an attempt to gain power, which she has wielded over people like Brittany Venti, The Quartering, Yellow Flash, That Umbrella Guy, and others. Further, her use of flirtatious complimentary behavior with multiple men, be it Ian Crossland, Elon Musk, or Shane Cashman, could be described as manipulative, if not outright exploitative. I said on Twitter while researching this video that I found Eliza's ass in the data. And trust me, despite all attempts to hide her world star hip-hop music video, it is not difficult to find her ass. And I think I did, not in the video, but in the data. But hang on, because there's even more data to examine. A massive analysis of the virtuous victim effect was conducted by Jordan and Kuchowski in 2021, which included a total of 17 experiments. In their first vignette, subjects learned that the protagonist, Sarah, was a college student who was studying for an exam with her classmates. While studying, one classmate, Gabrielle, looked something up on Sarah's iPad. In the neutral condition, the vignette simply ended there, while in the victim condition, Gabrielle stole the iPad. Those who read that Sarah's iPad had been stolen perceived Sarah as possessing higher moral character and being more trustworthy than neutral Sarah. In an additional experiment using the same stimuli, one condition included a minimal victim condition in which, rather than specifying that Gabrielle stole the iPad, merely that it had been stolen without any specification as to whom had committed the crime. In this instance, victim Sarah was seen as more moral than neutral Sarah, but not as more trustworthy. Thus, even in a scenario wherein the misdeed does not have a specific perpetrator, and in this situation respondents could also likely have inferred that Sarah simply misplaced the iPad, the victim of some loss is still seen as being more moral than a non-victim, when a victim does not specify who has victimized them though, such as was the case with Eliza Blue, who made little more than vague allusions as to who had trafficked her, be it a famous musician to a famous athlete.
The high-profile musician said, come out to Los Angeles, we'll start a music career, you're gonna be a model, you're gonna be a musician, you're gonna be famous. One thing that was so alluring about my trafficker at this point was that he was high profile. So I'll say this, and then we'll just leave that where it is. He's a high profile athlete.
A potentially dangerous claim, as she has dated both. While that victim is still perceived of as virtuous, others will not inherently be more trusting, perhaps being curious as to the details of the victimization, which in Eliza's case led to her story unraveling. In another experiment using the iPad scenario, either the iPad was left unperturbed, Gabrielle stole the iPad, or Gabrielle stole valuable jewelry from Sarah. After reading one of these three stories, participants played a trust game, either with someone who they were informed was another participant in the experiment, or with Sarah, who, depending on which version of the story they read, they may have believed to have been a victim of theft. In this game, each participant was allocated 30 cents and could choose to send any amount, or none at all, to the other player. Whatever amount was sent would be tripled, such that if a player shared their entire 30 cents, the other player would receive 90 cents. The other player could then send back any amount of money again, from none to the entire pot. Participants were asked how moral the other player was and how much money, from 0 to 100% of the earnings, they believed the other player would return at the end of the game. In general, Sarah was rated as more moral and trustworthy when she was a victim, but of the two victim conditions, was seen as most moral and most trustworthy when Gabrielle stole her iPad compared to when she stole her jewelry. Perhaps because Sarah had demonstrated a willingness to trust Gabrielle with her iPad, and thus the theft was seen as particularly egregious, thus painting Sarah as superior in terms of trustworthiness and morality. Subjects reported that victimized Sarah did not differ from a random stranger in how much she would return to the participant in the trust game, however, illustrating that even if people believe that victims are more moral than non-victims, we do not necessarily expect them to actually behave more morally. Further research using the iPad narrative stimuli manipulated the race and sex of the characters in the story and found no influence of either race nor sex on perceptions of victimhood morality nor trustworthiness. Perhaps victims are given a type of moral leniency as recompense for their misfortune, where they are perceived of as virtuous and yet, due to their victim status, are given leeway to not necessarily behave more morally than others. It is for this reason that it took as long as it did for anyone to notice certain behaviors of Eliza Blue, from her vagueness and often conflicting stories to her frequent requests for money, no evidence of exactly what she was going to do with it to help victims. As a victim, she was seen as inherently virtuous, but there was no additional expectation that she need actually display that virtue more so than any person at random.
Who the f*** are you?
An additional experiment using the stimuli examined willingness to help a victim of intentional malfeasance or accidental damage. In this study, Sarah's iPad was either stolen, left alone, or damaged in an earthquake, and subjects were asked how good assisting Sarah would look in the eyes of others and if they were inclined to help her. They found that participants thought it would look best to help Sarah when she had been the victim of theft rather than the victim of an accident, and indicated they personally would be more incentivized to help Sarah when the victimization was due to malicious behavior rather than to an act of God. These results are perhaps because to help a victim of some bad actor not only aids the victim, but serves as an implicit denunciation of the person who has wronged them. Another variant described Sarah either as possessing positive traits, such as intelligence, athleticism, sociability, and funniness, or as possessing a high degree of morality, and either as a victim of theft or a victim of an accident, with her iPad being destroyed either by an earthquake or by her cat knocking it off of a table. Sarah was seen as more moral when Gabrielle had stolen from her, and as equally moral when she had been the victim of an accident, as she was seen when nothing had happened to her iPad. In contrast, Sarah was seen as possessing more positive traits when she was the victim of any type of misfortune, but possessing the most positive traits when she had been victimized by another human being. There is a seeming halo effect then for victims, specifically of other people and not of accidents, in that not only are they seen as uniquely moral, they are perhaps a little bit funnier and more sociable, although we'll look more into the trait of intelligence later. However, this halo effect may explain why someone like Eliza Blue seemingly so easily worked her way into the good graces of so many people. Because not only as a victim was she seen as particularly moral, but also as a better, more competent person in general, although you wouldn't know that from her many earlier failed attempts to become famous, be it on Blind Date, American Idol, or The Steve Harvey Show.
Nanny? Nana? Nani?
The second vignette described a target character, Sam, who worked at an advertising agency and who had come up with a new slogan.
Have you seen this? He's got sunglasses on.
And in the victim condition, this idea was stolen by his manager, Gordon, who did not credit Sam for his work.
You disappoint me, Ramsey.
Sam was seen consistently as more moral and more trustworthy when his idea had been stolen compared to when Sam had simply had a good idea. An additional study using the idea theft narrative intentionally manipulated participants' perceptions of the morality of the neutral or victim target to examine willingness to punish the perpetrator by giving Gordon the cold shoulder, confronting him with disapproval, or reporting his actions to HR, or perhaps even defeating him in a fish pie duel and forcing him to retire from the culinary arts forever.
So the winner is... Come on, James.
Oh, yes!
Oh, fuck off.
Seriously?
Yeah, 3-2 for you.
Or, in contrast, and back to the real stimuli, to help Sam by aiding him in brainstorming new ideas, complimenting him, or being extra friendly. One version described victimized Sam as being particularly moral, being someone who donates money, volunteers, and behaves pro-socially towards friends and family. Another condition described Sam not as moral but as competent, being skilled at cooking and running. After reading one of the vignettes, subjects were asked how willing they would be to punish the idea thief, Gordon, or to help the victim, Sam. When Sam was described as moral, participants reported seeing him as more moral and trustworthy compared to the neutral and competent conditions, and were more willing both to help him and to punish Gordon. When Sam was described as a competent victim, relative to the neutral condition, subjects were more willing to help him out but not to punish Gordon, and their degree of willingness to help him was lower than when Sam was described as moral. Competent victims then seemed to be less sympathetic than virtuous ones. To encourage others to help you, by say, donating money to you then, a victim is best suited to emphasize his or her own morality and de-emphasize his or her own competence. If one wished to manipulate others into aiding them, that person should promote their pro-social work, illustrating how they themselves aid others, and simultaneously promote an air of incompetence, such as being unable to even afford internet access. To maximize victim resource extraction, one should depict him or herself as a weak but virtuous person. Curiously, exactly what Eliza Blue did across her various appearances on podcasts and interviews. Incompetent but emphasizing her virtue, perhaps she should consider running for control of the Tory party. Besides, she could gain additional sympathy by just claiming to be post-op Bojo. Using a revised version of the advertising agency scenario, an additional experiment tasked respondents to imagine that they worked at such an agency, and either that the company culture was one where the brainstorming system had been frequently abused for idea theft, and as such, that he or she had been a vocal critic of that system, or that the brainstorming system had rarely been abused, instead producing effective work, and as such, that he or she had been a vocal defender of it. This experiment was designed to test for the influence of internal consistency on opinions towards punishing perpetrators or helping victims. Cognitive dissonance is a feeling of psychological discomfort created by a misalignment of one's former beliefs or actions with currently conflicting information. For example, if I had previously publicly defended the integrity of a story of a person claiming to be a victim of trafficking, because I'm a proponent of such victims seeing justice, and then I later learn that story not only lacks integrity, but seems to be largely, if not entirely fabricated, that misalignment will cause psychological discomfort or even pain.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
There are a few ways that we can respond to an instance of cognitive dissonance. We can reject the new information as being fake and perhaps even gay. We can ignore the new information, putting our fingers in our ears and claiming it's all just pointless drama. Or we can accept the new information and change our previously held opinion on the validity of the story. Accepting new information and changing our beliefs is the least common outcome, in large part because to accept that we were wrong creates even more psychological discomfort. So, how did dissonance influence perceptions of victimization? After being asked to imagine having previously been supportive or critical of the brainstorming system, subjects read the advertising agency narrative, wherein in one condition, Sarah's idea was stolen, making her a victim, or in the other condition, where no idea theft occurred. When participants had imagined that they had previously been opposed to the brainstorming system, and then read that Sarah had been victimized by that system, Sarah was seen as more moral and trustworthy compared to when she was a neutral target. In contrast, when participants imagined that they had previously been supportive of the brainstorming system, and then read that Sarah had been victimized by that same system that they themselves had supported, there was no longer any relationship between victim status and perceptions of Sarah as either being trustworthy nor as moral. From these findings, we could extrapolate that cognitive dissonance can seriously influence perceptions of a victim as being virtuous. For example, if one had previously portrayed a certain person as a victim of trafficking, and then a lot of people began to question that backed up with a plethora of evidence, belief in that victim's morality and trustworthiness may remain stable simply to avoid the psychological discomfort of cognitive dissonance. No one wants to look like a hypocrite. A slight variation of the dissonance-evoking experiment was used to better understand perceptions about the appropriateness of punishing perpetrators and helping victims when to do so would contradict previous behaviors. This time, subjects read that James was an employee at the advertising agency, who had previously either been supportive or critical of the brainstorming practice. After then reading about Sarah, whose idea either was or was not stolen by Gabrielle, depending on the condition, respondents were asked to what degree punishing the idea thief or helping Sarah aligned with James's goals and self-interest. Participants were then asked to take James's perspective and imagine, from his position, how much he would perceive of Sarah as a victim in either condition.
You're now going to get macheted to death.
When James had previously spoken out against the brainstorming sessions at the firm, subjects reported that Sarah was more of a victim and that James was more incentivized to punish Gabrielle and to help Sarah. In opposition, when James had been supportive of the brainstorming session, participants still reported that Sarah was a victim, but also that it was not in James's self-interest to either help her nor to punish anyone. Thus, from an outside perspective, while someone who has been victimized will still be seen as a victim whether or not a third party has previously supported a system that led towards their victimization, people are only expected to help said victim pursue retribution against a perpetrator when the victimization was the product of a system that person, him or herself, had directly propped up. It is perhaps why there was such consternation from the audience towards Tim Pool's lack of coverage of the Eliza Blue story and subsequent publications, which failed in any way to question that story, because for the audience, they saw Blue's actions, specifically the silencing of critics on social media, as being heavily contradictory to the values of Timcast.
DJ Zeno says unsubbed on members only after over a year. Here's $5 FU for, I'm pretty bummed. Thought you stood against censorship, hope you change.
And therefore, even while some may have continued to see her as a victim, they likely did not believe there was any moral responsibility to continue to help her after it became clear that her behavior did not align with the previously stated moral beliefs and values associated with the Timcast brand, namely being anti-censorship and promoting honesty and transparency in journalism. Even if people did believe Eliza had been abused in some way, many believed the contradictions would not incentivize any further support of her publicly. The third vignette described a patient, either Sarah or Sam, seeking help from a medical doctor, Dr. Wilson, to help with the treatment of Crohn's disease.
Excuse me, I have to go kill someone.
And in the victim condition, the doctor recommended the drug prednisone to the patient, even though he believed it would have adverse effects, namely nausea, vomiting, increased sweating or acne, or trouble sleeping, and ultimately it did harm the patient.
It's funny how statistics can prove anything at all. But be realistic, it's psychological.
Additional information was provided to participants regarding the patient, including their occupation, marital status, political affiliation, religious background, and hobbies, as well as information about the patient's moral character, including that he or she tended to be a bit self-focused and gets defensive when criticized, but also that the patient had a good sense of humor and usually comes through when you need a favor. In this instance, relative to the neutral patient, the victimized patient was seen as more moral, but not as more trustworthy. Thus, even when she was described as a flawed person, she was still seen as superior morally. People may then tend to still see victims as uniquely virtuous despite their imperfections. And I would argue that Eliza's biggest mistake was by demanding censorship of those just asking questions about her past.
You know, have you ever had a pimp?
Why would I have a pimp?
Well,
No.
I'm asking because you're speaking like you're speaking from the perspective of someone that's been there, and it's just not the case. I'm asking because I feel like that's an honest question, because I've had a few.
Not only because she created reactance, a Streisand effect, but because had she just admitted that she had been in those music videos, done sex work, etc., I think the majority of people would not have cared. Not only because it seemingly does align with her general story anyway, at least as long as one doesn't look at it very closely, but also because of the unique morality bestowed upon victims, a perception her subsequent behavior has done much to immolate. The fourth vignette described a party wherein the protagonist character, Josh, mentioned to another partygoer, Chelsea, that he was a gun owner, and in the victim condition, Chelsea became irate and verbally attacked Josh for his gun ownership. In this instance, victimized Josh was seen as more trustworthy and more moral than neutral Josh. Jordan and Kuchaki's fifth vignette significantly differed in results from the other experiments in the set. This scenario described a college student protagonist, Elizabeth, at a party who had been flirting with a man, Chris. After flirting, they went back to his place, started fooling around, and then Elizabeth abruptly asked him to stop. In the victim condition, Chris did not stop, and the story stated that this made Elizabeth feel very upset. The narrative did not elaborate on the nature of his continued advances, leaving it up to the reader's interpretation. In this instance, victim Elizabeth was not seen as more moral nor as more trustworthy than neutral Elizabeth, perhaps indicating that when someone is seen as having encouraged or instigated some behavior, when that encouraged behavior then occurs, the person who did the encouraging is not seen as a virtuous victim. I do not believe that these results are indicative that the participants were somehow sexist because they didn't elevate the victim in this case in the way that victims so often are, but rather because the victim instigated the behavior and then changed her mind after the fact. And personally, I agree with the participants. I don't think it's unreasonable for a man to be confused and perhaps think that a woman in this scenario is playing hard to get after she instigated the sexual encounter.
Hold on. This whole operation was your idea.
Anakin, what have you done? How could you hurt her like that? Master, she's just being overdramatic. Honestly, I've choked her much harder during foreplay in the bedroom.
But then again, I'm a millennial. Sexual relationships between young people these days seems so complicated to me that they might as well have a challenge rating. The point is, when one has done something voluntarily and then later decided that they regretted that action, be it being a paid model or a sex worker or appearing in sexualized music videos for which you were paid, outside observers will seemingly be less willing to see that person as a virtuous victim when that claim of victimhood is a product of regretting their past decisions. In their sixth and final vignette, things got a bit more serious and direct than in previous accounts. This story described a woman, Kelly, walking home from the grocery store when a male acquaintance, Dave, spotted her on the street and asked to help carry her groceries into her apartment. You could perhaps guess, dear viewer, where the victimhood version of this particular story is about to turn quite dark.
Oh boy, I'm gonna take you to the... Okay, you have a gun, I'm sorry.
In the victim condition, Dave locked the door behind him after bringing in the groceries and proceeded to, commit Minecraft YouTuber behavior on Kelly, covering her mouth and threatening her with further violence if she dared scream. Just to illustrate that the previous example regarding the flirting in the club was not indicative that the respondents in these studies just simply didn't believe women, Kelly was seen as significantly more moral and more trustworthy when she had been victimized compared to when she had not been victimized by Chris, and he had just helped her out with her groceries. Across all but one of these examples then, being a victim, and specifically being a victim of SA, is a condition that is seen as uniquely moral and worthy of trust. We want to trust victims and actually see them as more trustworthy than non-victims in general. Seemingly the only time that we don't trust victims is when we have reason to believe that the victim has done something to instigate the victimizing scenario, such as was the case across much of the Amber Heard trial. For while Johnny Depp may have said offensive things to her while he was intoxicated, Amber was physically violent and consistently verbally abusive towards him, which alongside her countless demonstrable lies, produced an instance wherein someone claiming to be a victim was seen by the public as being neither trustworthy nor as moral. Across all of these vignettes, the scholars found that victims were seen as more trustworthy and moral when the narratives were thick.
Damn, boy. Damn, boy, he's thick.
Providing lots of information about the perpetrator in greater detail compared to thinner narratives, such as the story of the stolen iPad, wherein it was not clear who the thief even was or how it had been pilfered. Across numerous studies, no relationship between race nor sex and victim morality and trustworthiness were identified, meaning that this effect seemingly is universal, and actually it was quite nice to see that no element of this was based on discriminatory beliefs about different groups of people.
They are a bunch of treacherous, lamb-burning, work-shy peasants.
Perhaps it's unethical to provide advice to those who want to be seen as virtuous victims for the purpose of resource extraction, but if you are a true victim of some injustice, it seems that greater deference will be given to you in terms of perceived morality and trustworthiness if your story has more details. In the case of Eliza Bleu, one thing that has perplexed many of those who have either interviewed her or investigated her story is a curious lack of almost any detail and the conflicting nature of much of her claims, including her aversion to answering any specific questions.
I'd like to keep it private because my traffickers are still out there and very active, so.
Inevitably, Eliza would have been caught up in her lies precisely because of her lack of detail, which seemingly produces lower degrees of trust and perceived morality that are typically bestowed upon victims. All Eliza had to do was give specifics and name names, but if she wasn't really a victim, doing so surely would have landed her in far hotter water, legally at least, than the online criticism that she's faced could ever approach in temperature. Two experiments in this set examined the relevance of first versus third-person narratives, one using the iPad vignette and the other using the idea theft narrative, in which the story was modified to either describe it as being told from a first-person perspective of the target character, portrayed either neutrally or as a victim, or from a third-person perspective. In the case of the iPad theft, the scholars found that there was no relationship between perceived morality and victimhood when the narrative was given from the first-person perspective. There was actually a small negative relationship between trustworthiness and victimhood when the victim was telling the story from his or her own perspective. In contrast, victims were still seen as more moral and trustworthy than neutral targets, regardless of perspective, in the idea theft narrative experiment. It is possible that when victims are giving their own version of events, outside observers are more skeptical compared to when a third party is reporting on an instance of victimization then. Although these results were not unilaterally consistent, we could surmise then that if you want to maximize your image as that of a virtuous victim, you should have someone else, say a journalist, tell your story for you, rather than telling it for yourself over and over and over again, as it seems to portray the victim as more trustworthy and more moral. It implies external verification and scrutiny, and lends the alleged victim more credibility.
Hello, I'm Tom Hanks. The U.S. government has lost its credibility, so it's borrowing some of mine.
Tousle my hair, Mr. Hanks.
Sure thing, son.
While I would never suggest that Eliza Bleu is aware of these data, she does seem to have guessed correctly that attempting to woo a journalist with excessive compliments to report on her narrative for her would potentially create greater belief in the public eye of her personal morality or trustworthiness compared to her many attempts at ambiguously describing that same story. This could be precisely not because she's clueless, but because Machiavellianism appears to be negatively related to emotional intelligence, while being positively related to manipulativeness. Or at least, she would have guessed correctly if she had not also believed that she was entitled to exact revenge against those who were just asking questions about that story by having them banned from Twitter and striking YouTube videos. So she guessed right, but seemingly just couldn't help herself by not also being vengeful and vindictive when it came to this particular, somewhat spurious relationship between variables. On the subject of Eliza, our case study specifically, and her intelligence in orchestrating all of the drama that she has found herself involved in, several studies in this massive set examined the relationship between competence and victimhood, including the iPad scenario and the narrative concerning the doctor who prescribed medicine to his patient that he knew would have adverse effects. In both cases, victims were seen as more moral and trustworthy regardless of their degrees of competence, both in terms of athleticism and intelligence. There was a significant but small relationship of victimhood on athleticism that became more significant when controlling for morality, trustworthiness, and intelligence, meaning that people who are seen as victims are also seen as being more physically capable, perhaps as a product of having survived their misfortune, which would be particularly relevant in the case of a negligent doctor, for instance. However, this effect was quite minimal. In contrast, there was no relationship between victim status and intelligence, and instead, when controlling for morality, trustworthiness, and athleticism, the relationship between being perceived of as a victim was negatively related to intellectual competence. That is, people don't seemingly expect victims to be particularly smart, and when controlling for trust and finding victims as virtuous, the expectation is the opposite, that victims are seen as less intelligent than the average person. Perhaps one of the reasons why Eliza's claims about being a victim of trafficking remained unchecked and unquestioned for so long, despite being confusing and contradictory and outright bizarre, such as her stating to Michael Malice that people using images of her on Twitter was somehow a form of human trafficking, was because the people talking to Eliza due to her victim identity probably just didn't expect her to be very intelligent and thus didn't question her further. Something that could certainly be abused by an individual who is, in fact, high in Machiavellianism and likely is not stupid, but instead merely plain stupid for the camera, all for the purpose of resource extraction. Most of the experiments found no effect of victim status on predictions of moral or immoral behavior, meaning victims were not expected to be more moral than non-victims, which could explain again why it took so long for anyone to notice the cracks in Eliza's story. No one anticipated her to be particularly smart, nor even demand any evidence of her actual virtue. The researchers referred to this as the upsetness hypothesis, in that on one hand, victims are expected to be more moral than non-victims because they are seen as virtuous, yet on the other, because victims are upset due to having been wronged, we may anticipate that victims may perform immoral acts because they're upset. This upsetness hypothesis may then explain why so many people were seemingly willing to turn a blind eye to the parts of Eliza Blue's story that didn't make any sense, or changed and evolved, or to the lack of any evidence of her actual work with victims beyond just tweets. Maybe on some level, most people knew that Eliza's claims of being such a public paragon, not even being able to afford internet access because of her selflessness, was patently false and ridiculous, but were willing to ignore the absurdity because she was a victim, and we give victims a wide berth to lie, or manipulate, or grift because they are upset, and those bad behaviors are somehow justified. But with all of that in mind, let's come to a few conclusions. Over the course of this video, we've seen the benefits of claiming or even seeing oneself as a victim. In general, people see victims as more moral and more trustworthy than the average person, and because of that belief, victims, real or invented, are given certain special privileges, be it actual resources including attention or even wealth, or being waived the typical ethical concerns that would be placed on others, allowing them to behave immorally and vengefully, as those around them believe such actions are retributive against a world that has caused them harm in the first place. In most instances, people hold victims as morally superior and therefore more valuable in some sense than the rest of us, and not entirely without good reason. Obviously, we want to help those who have been victimized, particularly when they use their position to help others, acting as virtuous victims. The problem arises when the goodwill of the average person is abused by those with ulterior motives. Perhaps people who suffer from borderline or histrionic personality disorders, and who recognize that they can manipulate the generosity and deference the position of a virtuous victim provides. And that is where you find people like Amber Heard or Eliza Blue. People who will extort human altruism for personal power, fame, and money. I have used Eliza Blue as a case study in this video to ground the research that we have discussed, because she seems to exemplify the virtuous victimhood phenomenon. She is perpetually being mistreated, usually by nameless others. She constantly messages about her own good deeds while not needing to actually do anything. And she has reaped the rewards of her virtuous victim status by promoting herself, be it on podcasts or to Elon Musk himself. Eliza is nearly a perfect exemplar of why you never believe all women, nor believe all victims, nor all people, without asking questions, because, for as vile as it may seem to most of us, to stand on the backs of real victims of something as serious and revolting as human trafficking to become famous and manipulate others, well, such people do exist, and they hold no such similar qualms regarding their own virtuous victim violations. To people like that, those of us who actually care are nothing more than targets, than marks, than simps, all just waiting to be exploited. But hey, what do you guys think? Do you think victims should be seen as more moral and trustworthy than non-victims? Do you think that personality disorders could play a role in those who abuse the victim identity? Have you ever met a less than virtuous victim who used their status to gain power or resources from others? Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Not only because I'm genuinely curious, but because it really helps me out in the algorithm. Also, while you're down there, be sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, and hit the bell button to be notified when I upload because, well, these videos, as you might imagine, take a long time to put together, particularly this one because of the involvement of the case study and having to find information about her, which she is rapidly and consistently trying to hide. If you really liked the video and would like to see your name on the screen at the end of my videos along with these amazing folks here, and thank you all so much for supporting me, you can also support my work on Patreon or Subscribestar, also linked below. If that's not something you're interested in, you can also support me by becoming a member of the channel or by buying some merch from my merch store. Finally, if you want to see more of me, you can find me on my podcast channel, Broken Crown, where I stream about news and politics every Wednesday, and where we play tabletop role-playing games every Tuesday. Thank you so much for watching through this long video, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.